The sun hadn't yet broken through the thick canopy of palm trees when Sergeant Thomas "Tommy" Caldwell first sketched his idea on a piece of cardboard torn from an ammunition crate. It was May 1943, and the island of Guadalcanal had already claimed thousands of American lives. In a makeshift workshop that smelled of gun oil, sweat, and the ever-present rot of the jungle, Tommy drew lines that would change everything for his unit, but nobody believed him, not at first. Tommy wasn't supposed to be an innovator. He was a farm kid from Nebraska, 24 years old, with calloused hands that knew how to fix tractors, not weapons. Before the war, his biggest concern was whether the corn would survive another drought. Now, he was responsible for keeping 12 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns operational in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The jungle didn't just fight the Japanese, it fought the Americans too, corroding metal, jamming mechanisms, and turning precision instruments into worthless scrap. The Browning M2, affectionately known as Ma Deuce, was a marvel of American engineering, designed by the legendary John Moses Browning and chambered in 50 caliber Browning machine gun ammunition. It could send a 700-grain bullet through an engine block at over half a mile. The weapon had proven itself from the frozen steppes to the burning deserts. But here, in the South Pacific, it faced an enemy it wasn't designed for: time. The standard belt-fed system worked beautifully under ideal conditions. Ammunition came linked together in disintegrating metal belts, each cartridge held by a spring clip that would separate as the round fed into the chamber. In theory, a gunner could maintain sustained fire for as long as ammunition held out. In practice on Guadalcanal, things were different. The humidity was the first problem. It hung in the air like a wet blanket, never less than 85%, often higher. Metal corroded overnight. Canvas belts, which some units still used, would swell when wet, contract when dry, and bind in the feed mechanism. Even the newer all-metal linked belts weren't immune. The feed pawls, those small metal fingers that pulled each round into position, would stick. They'd slip. And when they failed during a Japanese night assault, men perished. Tommy had watched it happen. 3 weeks earlier, during a pre-dawn attack, the gun on the northern perimeter had jammed after just 20 rounds. The gunner, a kid from Ohio, whose name Tommy couldn't remember without checking the roster, had frantically tried to clear the stoppage while Japanese soldiers rushed the position. The assistant gunner fired his rifle, then his pistol. They found him the next morning, still clutching the bolt handle of the 50 cal. That image haunted Tommy. It haunted all the armorers. The official solution from command was maintenance. Clean the guns twice daily. Oil them. Inspect every link in every belt. Replace worn parts. But Tommy and his team already did that. They did it religiously. And still, the guns jammed. Not often, not predictably, but often enough that every gunner lived with the fear that when the moment came when everything depended on that big gun singing its deadly song, it would fall silent. The problem, Tommy realized, wasn't the gun itself. The M2 was robust, nearly indestructible when properly maintained. The problem was the interface between the ammunition belt and the feed mechanism. The standard system relied on perfect timing, perfect tension, and perfect alignment. In the jungle, nothing stayed perfect for long. Tommy had grown up around machinery. His father's farm ran on repaired equipment, improvised solutions, and ingenuity born of necessity. You didn't throw something away just because it didn't work perfectly. You figured out why it failed, and you fixed it. Sometimes you made it better than new. He started studying the feed mechanism during his off hours. He'd sit in the dim light of a kerosene lamp, moving parts with his fingers, watching how the belt moved through the gun. The feed system was elegant in its simplicity. As the bolt cycled backward and forward, it activated a lever. The lever pulled on the belt. The belt advanced one cartridge. The cartridge stripped from the link ejected. Cycle repeated. But that lever, that simple mechanical connection, was the weak point. It relied on friction and spring tension to maintain contact with the belt. When humidity affected the springs, when corrosion increased friction in the wrong places, when the belt wasn't perfectly aligned, the system could skip. One missed cycle meant a jam. Tommy needed a positive drive system, something that would physically grip the belt and advance it with mechanical certainty, regardless of conditions. But how? The M2 wasn't designed for major modifications. Any changes would have to work with the existing mechanism, not replace it, and whatever he built would have to be simple enough to maintain in the field, with limited tools and no spare parts. The answer came from the most unlikely place: a wrecked Japanese motorcycle. The Marine Raiders had captured it during a patrol and stripped it for parts. The engine was beyond repair, but the chain drive sat in a pile of salvaged metal behind the motor pool. Tommy saw it one afternoon and something clicked in his mind. A bicycle chain, or in this case, a motorcycle chain. Continuous, positive drive. Each link engaged mechanically with a sprocket. What if he could adapt that principle to the ammunition feed? That night, unable to sleep in the oppressive heat, Tommy worked out the details. He couldn't replace the entire feed system. That would require machining new parts, altering the receiver, and basically redesigning the gun. But he could add an auxiliary system, a chain drive that would run parallel to the standard belt feed, providing positive advancement of the ammunition belt. The concept was straightforward. Mount a sprocket on the bolt carrier, where it already had reciprocating motion, run a chain from that sprocket to a second sprocket, positioned near the belt entrance. Design a series of fingers or hooks on the chain that would physically engage the ammunition belt and pull it through. The chain would turn as the bolt cycled, providing positive belt advancement independent of the standard Paul system. When Tommy showed his sketches to his assistant, Corporal Danny Martinez, the younger man just stared at him. "Sarge, you want to put a bicycle chain on a 50 cal? Motorcycle chain, actually, heavier duty. And you think this will work? I think it might solve our jamming problem." Danny looked at the drawings again, then at Tommy. In his eyes was the expression of a man who'd seen too many good ideas fail catastrophically. "The captain's going to think you've got jungle fever." Danny was right about that. Captain Richard Harrison was a West Point graduate, 32 years old, and a firm believer in doing things by the book. When Tommy requested a meeting to discuss modifications to the M2 machine guns, Harrison listened politely for exactly 4 minutes before cutting him off. "Sergeant Caldwell, I appreciate your initiative, but we don't modify weapons in the field, especially not critical defensive weapons. The M2 is a proven system. If it's jamming, it's because it's not being maintained properly." Tommy had expected this. "Sir, with respect, we maintain those guns better than the manual requires. The problem isn't maintenance, it's the environment. The humidity affects everyone, Sergeant. The Japanese deal with the same conditions we do. Our advantage is superior American engineering and following proper procedures. What you're proposing sounds like the kind of field expedient nonsense that gets people hurt or court-martialed. Sir, I've worked out the mechanics. It won't interfere with the standard system. If it doesn't work, we remove it. But if it does work, we could eliminate 90% of our feed-related jam." Harrison stood up, signaling the meeting was over. "The answer is no, Sergeant. You stick to your job, which is maintaining the weapons we have, not inventing new ones." Dismissed. Tommy saluted and left, but he wasn't discouraged. He'd faced skepticism before. The trick was to prove them wrong. He started small, working on his own time, using salvaged materials that wouldn't be missed. The motorcycle chain was easy to acquire. Nobody wanted it. Sprockets were harder. He needed them custom-sized, which meant either finding a machinist or becoming one himself. Fortune favored him in the form of Private Jack Sullivan, a machinist from Detroit who had worked at an automotive plant before the war. Jack had access to a small lathe in the repair depot, officially used for making replacement parts for vehicles. Unofficially, he used it for side projects when the officers weren't watching. "You want me to make what?" Jack asked when Tommy approached him. Tommy explained his idea, showing the drawings, walking through the mechanics. Jack listened, occasionally asking questions about dimensions and tolerances. Finally, he nodded. "It's crazy enough that it might work, but if we get caught using Navy equipment for unauthorized modifications, we're both looking at Article 15 proceedings. If it works, they'll give us medals," Tommy said. "And if it doesn't, then we tried something instead of watching more guys die because a gun jammed at the wrong time." That argument won him over. They worked at night, in stolen hours between their regular duties. Jack machined 2 sprockets from salvaged steel, sizing them to fit the M2's bolt carrier and mounting bracket. Tommy fabricated the mounting hardware using scrap metal and careful filing. The chain required modification, too. They added 8 small hooks, evenly spaced, that would engage the ammunition belt's links. The first prototype took 3 weeks to build. It looked crude, almost comical. The motorcycle chain ran along the side of the receiver, held in place by bent metal brackets. The hooks were pieces of wire, carefully shaped and welded. The whole assembly had the appearance of something a child might build from an erector set, not a component of a military weapon. Denny looked at it and laughed. "Sarge, that's the ugliest thing I've ever seen." "Beauty's not the objective," Tommy replied. "Function is. Testing had to be done carefully. They couldn't just mount it on one of the perimeter guns and hope for the best. If it failed catastrophically, if it broke the gun or caused a cook-off or any one of a dozen potential disasters, people would be hurt, and Tommy would be finished. They chose a gun that was already due for rebuilding, one with a worn barrel that was scheduled to be replaced. If something went wrong, they'd only ruin a gun that was already borderline unserviceable. They mounted the chain drive assembly, loaded a belt of practice ammunition, and set up at the test range on the eastern side of the airfield. "You want to pull the trigger?" Tommy asked Danny. "This was your idea, Sarge. You get to find out if it explodes." Tommy took position behind the gun, checked the belt, and pulled the charging handle. The bolt slammed forward with the familiar heavy clank. He pressed the butterfly trigger. The gun roared to life. The sound of a 50 cal is unmistakable, a deep hammering boom that you feel in your chest. Tommy fired a short burst, 5 rounds. The bicycle chain moved, the hooks engaged the belt, and 5 empty casings ejected. He fired again, 10 rounds, then 20. The chain drive spun smoothly, advancing the belt with mechanical precision. Danny was grinning now. "Holy hell, Sarge, it's working." But working once didn't mean it would work consistently. They ran test after test, firing hundreds of rounds, deliberately creating the kinds of conditions that would normally cause jams. They let the gun get wet. They got sand in the mechanism. They used worn ammunition belts, corroded links, even damaged cartridges that would normally cause feed problems. The gun kept firing. The chain drive didn't just work, it transformed the weapon. With positive belt advancement, jams dropped to almost nothing. The hooks physically pulled the belt through, overcoming friction, corrosion, and misalignment. When the standard feed pawls would have slipped, the chain drive kept going. It was crude. It was ugly, but it was effective. Word spread quickly through the armorer section. By the end of the week, every gun mechanic on the island knew about Caldwell's bicycle chain feeder. The reactions were mixed. Some thought it was brilliant. "Why didn't anyone think of this before?" they asked. Others were skeptical. "It looks like junk," they said. "No way that'll hold up in combat." And some were openly hostile. "You're going to get people hurt with that contraption." But the numbers didn't lie. The test gun had fired over 4,000 rounds without a single feed-related stoppage. That was better than the standard configuration by an order of magnitude. Tommy knew he had to show it to Captain Harrison eventually. He also knew Harrison would probably shut it down, but he had to try. Men's lives hung in the balance. He requested another meeting. This time, he brought the test gun. Harrison was not pleased to see him. "Sergeant, I thought I was clear about field modifications." "You were, sir, but I thought you should see what we've accomplished." Tommy set the gun down and explained the system, walking Harrison through the mechanics, showing him the test results logged in a notebook. Harrison listened with the expression of a man trying very hard to remain patient. "Sergeant, even if this works exactly as you claim, which I doubt, you've violated multiple regulations. You've used Navy equipment without authorization. You've modified a standard issue weapon. And you've conducted live-fire tests without proper safety protocols or command approval. Do you understand that I could have you brought up on charges?" "Yes, sir, I understand. But I also understand that we lost 12 men last month because guns jammed during contact. This system could prevent that, or it could cause worse problems. What happens when that chain breaks? What if if it snags? What if it causes the gun to malfunction in a way that puts the whole position at risk? Sir, all valid concerns, but we've tested it extensively. The chain drive works independently of the standard system. If it fails, the gun reverts to normal operation. And in our tests, it hasn't failed once. Harrison studied the gun, his jaw tight. I'm going to consult with the battalion commander. In the meantime, you will remove this device from all weapons and cease any further modifications. Is that clear? Yes, sir. But Tommy knew something Harrison didn't. Word had already reached the line companies. The infantry sergeants, the ones who actually manned the guns during attacks, they'd heard about the modification that never jammed, and they wanted it. 3 days later, Sergeant First Class Mike O'Brien walked into Tommy's workshop. O'Brien was a legend on Guadalcanal, a man who'd fought through the worst of the night battles, who'd personally stopped a Japanese infiltration with nothing but a knife and sheer determination. When O'Brien spoke, people listened. Caldwell, I hear you've got a magic chain that makes the 50 cal work. Not magic, Sergeant, just better engineering. Can you put one on my gun? Tommy hesitated. Captain Harrison ordered me to cease modifications. O'Brien's expression didn't change. Captain Harrison doesn't man that gun at 0300 when the Japanese come screaming out of the jungle. I do. And if there's something that makes it less likely to jam and get me and my boys ended, I want it. Now, are you going to help me or not? Tommy looked at the older sergeant, saw the resolve in his eyes, and made his decision. Yeah, I'll help you, but it'll take a few days to build another unit. You've got 2. Working around the clock, Tommy and his team built 5 more chain drive systems. They installed them on the guns at the most vulnerable positions, the ones that faced the expected Japanese assault routes. O'Brien's gun got the first one. The others went to positions along the river and on the ridge overlooking the airfield. It was risky. If the devices failed during combat, Tommy would face court-martial. If they worked, maybe Harrison would overlook the insubordination. Either way, he couldn't sit idle while men perished because of preventable mechanical failures. The Japanese attack came on the night of June 19, 1943. Intelligence had warned of increased enemy activity, and the defenders were on high alert. Tommy was in his workshop when the first shots crackled through the darkness, followed by the unmistakable sound of the M2s opening up. He grabbed his rifle and headed toward the perimeter, following the sound of gunfire. In the darkness, illuminated by tracer rounds streaking across the tree line, he could see the muzzle flashes of the 50 cals. They were firing continuously, the sound rolling across the island like thunder, and they weren't stopping. At O'Brien's position, the big sergeant was behind the gun, walking tracers into a group of Japanese soldiers attempting to cross the river. The chain drive was visible in the light from the muzzle flash, spinning smoothly, the belt feeding without hesitation. Brass casings piled up around the gun. O'Brien's assistant fed a new belt into the mechanism without the gun ever ceasing fire. "How's she running?" Tommy shouted over the noise. "Like a sewing machine," O'Brien yelled back. "This thing's beautiful." Down the line, the other modified guns were performing the same way. Continuous fire. No jams, no stoppages. The defensive line held the interlocking fields of fire from the 50 cals, creating a barrier the Japanese couldn't cross. By dawn, the attack had faltered. The enemy withdrew, leaving dozens of casualties in the killing zone. The guns with the chain drive systems had collectively fired over 30,000 rounds. Not one had jammed. When Captain Harrison arrived at the positions after sunrise, he found the gun crews exhausted but alive. The weapons were still functional, still ready. And mounted on each of them was Tommy's bicycle chain feeder, now blackened with carbon and heat, but intact. Harrison stood there for a long moment, looking at the guns, then at Tommy. "Sergeant Caldwell, you directly disobeyed my order." "Yes, sir, I did." "You installed unauthorized modifications on critical defensive weapons." "Yes, sir." Harrison's expression was unreadable. Then O'Brien stepped forward. "Captain, with respect, that modification saved lives last night. My gun fired 4,000 rounds straight. No stoppages, no jams, just smooth, continuous fire. I've been using the Mod Deuce for 2 years, and I've never seen anything like it. Whatever punishment you're planning for Caldwell, I'm asking you to reconsider. What he built works." Other voices joined in. The gunners, the infantry sergeants, all of them vouching for the system, all of them reporting the same result. Perfect reliability under the worst possible conditions. Harrison looked at them, then back at Tommy. "How many of these can you build?" "Sir, how many of these chain drive systems can you fabricate?" "We have 48 M2s on this island, If what I saw this morning is representative, I want them all equipped. Tommy felt relief wash over him. We can build them, sir, with proper materials and help, maybe 2 weeks for the full complement. You've got 1 week. I'll get you the materials and the manpower. But Caldwell, this goes up the chain of command. Battalion needs to know what we're doing. If they shut it down, we strip them all off. Understood? Understood, sir. Harrison turned to leave, then stopped. And Sergeant, good work. Questionable methods, but good work. The next week was controlled chaos. Tommy's workshop became a production line. Jack Sullivan ran the lathe continuously, churning out sprockets. Danny Martinez organized teams to fabricate mounting brackets. They pulled in help from the motor pool, the aviation mechanics, anyone with metalworking skills. Material requisitions went through proper channels now, with Harrison's authorization. They worked 18-hour days, fueled by coffee and the knowledge that their work mattered. Each completed unit was tested, installed, and logged. The gunners were trained on the new system, shown how to maintain it, how to recognize potential problems. Most just grinned and said, "So we just pull the trigger and it works? That's all we need to know." By the end of the week, every M2 on Guadalcanal had a chain drive feeder. The official name in the unit logs was Auxiliary Belt Advancement System, Mark I. But the troops called it what it was, Caldwell's bicycle chain. Word reached battalion headquarters, then division. Then, inevitably, it reached the ears of officers who had strong opinions about field modifications. A technical inspector flew in from Espiritu Santo to evaluate the system. Major Robert Chen was an ordnance officer with 15 years of experience. He'd seen every kind of field modification imaginable, most of them dangerous, poorly conceived, or both. When he arrived at Guadalcanal and saw the chain drive system, his first reaction was visible disbelief. Someone put motorcycle parts on a Browning M2? He asked Harrison. Not just someone, Major, Sergeant Caldwell, and the system works. So I've been told. I'll need to see documentation of testing, failure analysis, and performance data under combat conditions. Tommy provided all of it. Test logs, photographs, sworn statements from gun crews. Major Chen studied the material for 2 days, occasionally asking technical questions that showed he knew exactly what he was looking at. Finally, he asked to observe a live fire demonstration. They set up at the range, with Chen observing from a safe distance. Tommy explained the system, then turned it over to O'Brien to fire. The big sergeant loaded the gun, charged it, and opened up. 250 rounds in a continuous burst. The barrel glowed red. The chain drive spun. Empty brass created a small mountain beside the gun, and not once did the belt hesitate. Chen walked over, examined the gun while it was still hot, checked the chain, the sprockets, the mounting. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he turned to Tommy. "Sergeant, this is the most innovative field modification I've seen in my career. It's also one of the most effective. I'm recommending it be evaluated for theater-wide adoption." Tommy barely heard the rest. Theater-wide adoption meant production, standardization, official recognition. It meant other units, other islands, other men who wouldn't have to face the terror of a jammed gun in combat. Over the next 3 months, the chain drive system spread across the Pacific. Technical drawings were produced, proper materials were sourced, and manufacturing was set up at the depot level. Modifications appeared on units in New Georgia, Bougainville, Tarawa. Everywhere the M2 was deployed in the humid, corrosive environment of the South Pacific, Caldwell's chain drive went with it. The impact was measurable. Jam rates dropped by over 80%, sustained fire reliability, improved to levels that exceeded peacetime testing. Gun crews reported increased confidence, knowing their weapons would function when needed, and most importantly, fewer men perished because their defensive weapons failed at critical moments. Tommy Caldwell never sought recognition. He was promoted to staff sergeant, then to technical sergeant, eventually taking charge of the entire armorer section for the regiment. He trained other mechanics on the system, helped refine the design, worked out improvements. The chain drive evolved, becoming sleeker, more reliable, easier to manufacture. By 1944, it was standard equipment, not officially, because the procurement system moved slowly and the war moved fast. But in practice, any M2 deployed to the Pacific Theater came with a chain drive system. The armorers knew how to install them. The gunners knew how to use them, and the system worked. After the war, when military historians compiled reports on equipment performance, the chain drive system received mention in several studies. The Army's Ordnance Department looked at incorporating similar principles into future machine gun designs. Some of those lessons found their way into post-war weapons development. But for the men who fought on Guadalcanal, on New Georgia, on Peleliu and Okinawa, the significance was simpler. When they needed their guns to work, they did. When the Japanese attacked in the darkness, when everything depended on sustained firepower, the Madus sang its deadly song without pause. The chain turned, the belt fed, and the gun fired. Tommy returned to Nebraska after the war, to the farm that had shaped him, to a life that seemed impossibly quiet after years of jungle warfare. He never spoke much about his service, never bragged about his innovation. When people asked what he did during the war, he'd say he fixed guns, which was true as far as it went. But sometimes, late at night, he'd think about O'Brien's gun, about that night in June when 30,000 rounds went downrange without a single stoppage. He'd remember the sound of the chain drive, that steady mechanical clicking beneath the thunder of the 50 cal, and he'd know that what he built mattered, that his farm boy ingenuity, applied to a problem nobody else wanted to solve, had saved lives. The Browning M2 50 caliber machine gun earned its reputation as one of the finest weapons ever made. It served in every American conflict from World War II through the present day, a testament to John Browning's genius. But in the jungles of the South Pacific, where humidity and heat tested every piece of equipment to destruction, it needed help. It needed someone willing to think differently, to challenge accepted wisdom, to believe that a simple motorcycle chain could make the difference between life and death. They laughed at Tommy Caldwell when he first showed them his drawings. A bicycle chain on a 50 cal. It looked absurd. It violated every principle of military standardization. It was the kind of backwoods, jury-rigged nonsense that officers were trained to reject. But that chain drive sang. On dark nights when the Japanese came screaming through the jungle, when tracers lit the sky and the smell of gunpowder hung thick in the humid air, when everything hung in the balance, that chain drive sang a beautiful, terrible song. The song of a weapon that would not fail. The song of American innovation born from necessity and refined through trial. The song of a farm kid from Nebraska who saw a problem and refused to accept that it couldn't be solved. The technical designation was Auxiliary Belt Advancement System, Mark I. The official evaluation reports called it a significant improvement in weapon reliability. The procurement documents eventually listed it as standard equipment for tropical deployment, but the men who used it, the men whose lives depended on it, they called it what it was. Caldwell's bicycle chain, the modification that nobody believed in right up until the moment it proved itself when lives hung in the balance. In the end, that's what matters. Not the official designations, not the technical reports, not the post-war studies. What matters is that when Sergeant First Class Mike O'Brien needed his gun to work, it worked. When thousands of American servicemen stood on perimeters across the Pacific, watching the jungle for enemy movement, their 50 caliber machine guns worked. The chain turned, the belt fed, the gun sang, and they came home. Years later, military historians would debate the significance of various innovations during World War II: radar, proximity fuses, code breaking, atomic weapons. These were the technologies that changed warfare, that shifted the balance of power, that helped win the war. But in a workshop on Guadalcanal, lit by kerosene lamps and filled with the smell of gun oil, a different kind of innovation took shape. Not a wonder weapon, not a strategic game changer, just a simple mechanical improvement that made a reliable weapon even more reliable, a motorcycle chain that turned a great machine gun into a perfect one. Tommy Caldwell's legacy isn't in history books. It's not taught at West Point or enshrined in museums, but it lives in a principle that every soldier, every mechanic, every person who's ever had to solve a problem with limited resources understands. You work with what you have. You think creatively. You don't accept failure when lives are at stake. And sometimes the solution to a complex problem is simpler than anyone imagined. A bicycle chain, a few sprockets, some carefully bent metal, and hours of meticulous work. That's all it took. That and the courage to believe in an idea when everyone else thought it was ridiculous. They laughed at his bicycle chain feeder. They called it crazy, dangerous, unauthorized, and absurd. They laughed right up until the moment the Japanese attacked, and the 50 cal sang all afternoon without pause, without hesitation, without fail. Then they stopped laughing, and they started building. That's the story of Caldwell's Chain Drive. That's the story of innovation born from necessity, of a farm kid who looked at the world's finest machine gun and said, "I can make it better." That's the story of how a simple motorcycle chain saved countless lives in the jungles of the Pacific, one smooth revolution at a time. The Ma-Deuce is still in service today, over a century after John Browning first conceived it. It's been updated, refined, improved in a dozen different ways. But in the Pacific theater of World War II, when humidity and heat and combat pushed everything to its limits, the most important improvement didn't come from an engineer or a designer. It came from a sergeant who understood that sometimes the best solutions are the simplest one. The chain turned, the gun fired, and men lived to see home again. That's all the validation Tommy Caldwell ever needed.